The play begins with Vivy sitting on the front porch of Mrs. Allison's home in Haslemere. Mr. Preed comes along and starts chatting with Vivy. We find out quite a bit of information from their little conversation. We first find out that Vivy is not a conventional female of the times. Preed likes that about her and talks about himself, seemingly patronizing Vivy. To put him in his place, Vivy starts discussing her education at Cambridge as a mathematics major. Instead of impressing him, Preed can't believe that she would rather learn things than experience culture, and can't believe that she then reveals that she doesn't like activities that have a lot of culture involved. She would much rather stay focused at her job at her friend's office. The subject then turns to Vivy's mother. Vivy's mother hasn't been around all that much in her life and has forbidden her to visit. Preed knows why, but refuses to tell Vivy why. She decides that she'll use the information that she is a secret against her mother. Preed almost relents and tells her what her mother does, but is interrupted by Mrs. Warren and her good friend Sir George Crofts. After Vivy leaves to make tea, Preed tells the others that they need to stop regarding her as a child because of all that she has accomplished. Her mother, however, refuses to treat her any differently. When Mrs. Warren leaves to go inside, Croft reveals that he wishes to marry Vivy, but doesn't think Mrs. Warren will allow it. Preed agrees that it's not a good idea. They also discuss Vivy's father and assure each other that it is not either of them. Phew. Just as the two men get up to go inside for tea, Frank, a good friend of Vivy's, stops by and they invite him inside as well. He then in secret tells Preed that he is in love with Vivy and is certain that she loves him. Just as they are about to go inside, Frank's father, Reverend Samuel Gardner, shows up. They discuss Frank marrying Vivy. He doesn't think that it's a good idea since Frank has been depending on his father for support and Vivy is not financially secure enough to support two people. Act 2 starts and everyone gets back together after partying for the afternoon that same evening. Mrs. Warren and Frank are the first to arrive. The two hit it off and start flirting with each other, and eventually Mrs. Warren leans in to give Frank a kiss. She becomes ashamed of herself because she believes that Frank should try and win her daughter over, not her. Frank then reveals to Mrs. Warren that he and Vivy have already been together in a sexual way. Mrs. Warren is stunned, and quite shocked, actually. Crofts and the Reverend are the next to arrive. They chat and eventually start discussing Vivy's future in regards to marriage. Frank lets them all know that he wishes to marry him herself. He does this subtly, of course. When the rest of the group shoots this down, he continues to press the subject. The final ones to return are Vivy and Preed. The whole party decides to eat. As everyone is having dinner, Mrs. Warren and Crofts steal into a different room and Crofts proposes to her. She turns him down and he angrily leaves. The rest of the group leaves to go home for the evening and Mrs. Warren is left alone with Vivy. Vivy and her are first plunged into awkward silence. Mrs. Warren wants the two of them to live together, but Vivy wants anything but that. Mrs. Warren becomes forceful with Vivy, but Vivy is quick to remind her that they know hardly anything about each other. Mrs. Warren starts crying and tells Vivy two huge things. The first thing is that she doesn't know who her father is. Vivy's father, of course. The second being that she turned to prostitution to keep herself independent of a man, and that is why Vivy was never allowed to visit her job. After then describing the kind of childhood that she had to Vivy, Vivy decides that she must vex her mother for what she did, and they make up. Act 3 starts in Frank's home with the pastor, Crofts, and Frank all sitting outside. Mrs. Warren and Vivy arrive, and the Reverend takes everyone on tour of the house. Frank and Vivy stay behind, however, and flirt with each other. After a little while, Crofts appears and kicks out Frank. Frank leaves and Crofts proposes to Vivy. Vivy turns him down politely, but Croft does not get the picture. He tries to convince her to marry him, but instead reveals that Mrs. Warren still owns a brothel. Vivy is disgusted. Frank appears again, having been listening to everything that was being said. He points a newly acquired rifle at Crofts and tells him to leave. Crofts gets in a last few words before leaving and tells the two that they are related. Frank loves Vivy, but she will not have any of it and leaves. Frank runs after her. Act 4 starts in Vivy's office where Frank is ready to talk to Vivy. Vivy is annoyed and refuses to go out with Frank. Frank stays anyways. He brings up what Crofts said about the two of them being related. Vivy doesn't care because she doesn't love him that way. Frank is hurt but respects her but respects her enough to not push further. Preed shows up to say goodbye as he is about to leave for Italy. Vivi gets upset because she feels judged from the two men. She decides to reveal to them her mother's profession. The two men are shocked. They tell her that they think she made the right decision. Vivi leaves, and Frank decides that he is okay with not being with her. He doesn't want to live off of money that has been earned in such an awful way, such as prostitution. Mrs. Warren appears suddenly and wants to see Vivi. Frank writes a note to Vivi explaining that he has come to terms with not being in a relationship. He leaves it on her desk for her to find later. He then tells Mrs. Warren that she should leave and not see Vivi. Mrs. Warren becomes emotional because she is hurt by Frank telling her to leave. Vivi returns before her mother has left and asks the two men to leave the room. Vivi then proceeds to tell her mother that she will support herself and doesn't want help financially because she knows that she is still involved in prostitution. Mrs. Warren keeps trying to convince Vivi to take help and such because she is still wealthy. When Vivi denies her once again, Mrs. Warren begs her to take care of her when she becomes old. Vivi wants to live her own life, though, so she says no. Mrs. Warren then says that she wishes that she had raised Vivi differently. She agrees that the two should end their relationship and leaves. Vivi finds the note that Frank left and reads it. She chuckles and throws it away. The end.